Hi, everyone. My name is Alexis Hope. I'm a researcher at the MIT Media Lab in Cambridge, a furniture designer at the Massachusetts College of Art and Design, and a creative learning fellow at LEGO. I wasn't supposed to start with that one. Today we're going to be talking about building joyful futures, which is important because the world is deeply messed up. We hear a lot about the terrible technological futures in store for us, and for many people, these terrible futures are actually the present. We live in a time where technology is eroding our civic, economic, and environmental lives. A lot of what I see the technology industry put out seems to be making things worse by amplifying inequalities and systems of oppression that have been around for a long time, and by solving problems faced by a select few at the expense of many. It can be hard to feel motivated to design technology against this backdrop, and that's something I really struggle with. But I believe in the possibility that we can make better worlds, or I really wouldn't be able to get out of bed in the morning. Perhaps a supermassive gravitational field so intense no matter can escape isn't everyone's idea of a joyful future, but it's pretty incredible, this image and this discovery, right? Everyone has probably seen this image by now. It represents a peak of human progress and innovation. They turned the Earth into a massive telescope. It's really quite cool. And many of you have probably seen this image too. This is a scientist, Dr. Katie Bowman, excitedly sharing the first few moments after they started to create this image. Unfortunately, soon after she shared this photo, she became the target of a sexist backlash that attempted to strip her of any credit for this incredible achievement. So there was this YouTube video that went viral. Woman does 6% of the work, but gets 100% of the credit. It's pretty awful. People trawled through her GitHub trying to find evidence to support their sexist narratives that she actually didn't contribute anything substantive to the project. And so even to undermine her role, they even circulated the photo of this man claiming he was the real hero behind the image and that he wrote 850,000 of the 900,000 lines of code. Until, to his credit, he quickly shut them down, explaining that Katie led the development of this algorithm that was pivotal to creating this image, and further that counting lines of code was a pretty useless way of measuring scientific contributions. The thing is, many people, both those who kind of rallied around Dr. Bowman in the aftermath of this backlash and those who are trying to tear her down, are missing the point about how science is done. There were over 300 researchers across so many different countries who came together to work together on what should be impossible. And scientific research of this magnitude is widely collaborative. And Dr. Bowman herself never claimed to be responsible for the discovery, claiming the spotlight should be on the team and on no individual person. Focusing on one person like this helps no one, including me. In the media and throughout history, though, we're addicted to the myth of the solitary genius. Many narratives about innovation and progress center on the lone genius and his or her, usually his, grand ambitions to change the world with a singular visionary idea. But this is not how radically better futures are invented, imagined, and created. Instead, I argue they're created in community, a fact that is obscured when we center any one person in a narrative about progress. Dr. Bowman's story is complicated. Hero narratives can have positive outcomes. It matters that Dr. Bowman is a female scientist in a time where, as her story clearly shows, the world is hostile towards female scientists. But our obsession with the lone genius obscures the fact that our futures are created in community, and a lone genius is in fact more likely to create a dystopia than a joyful future, in my opinion. So Dr. Bowman is a genius, but she's not on her own, and she would be the first one to agree. Dr. Bowman is building her joyful future in community with others. We are at present headed towards a different kind of black hole, a future where progress and innovation march forward, but this progress is not distributed equally. Unlike the black hole discovery, which is public and freely available to all, much of what we herald as innovations are more likely to make things more convenient for some people at the expense of others and make a few people a lot of money along the way than to make our future radically better. This is not the kind of future that I imagine. The future I imagine instead is one where people come together to care for one another, imagine and build many possible utopias and preferable futures. A joyful future is when we're in community with each other, when we feel a sense of connection, hope, optimism, and joy, when our needs are met, when we feel respected and free to let loose. All of that said, a joyful future is much, much easier said than done. So today I'm going to tell you a story about some of the joyful futures I've been working to build for the past few years. And this is a story about how we might build new futures and who gets to participate in the imagination of what could be. So like Dr. Bowman once was, I'm a researcher and graduate student at MIT. I work at the MIT Media Lab. For those of you who don't know it, the Media Lab is an interdisciplinary research lab sitting at the crossroads of art, design, engineering, and science. And our mission is to invent the future. It's a pretty confusing and wonderful and strange place to work. On a given day, I might see my colleagues testing out a prosthetic limb they built, creating a new opera with some kind of future musical instrument, or just driving a prototype micro-urban car around the halls like it's no big deal. Other people are engineering mosquitoes with CRISPR so they don't carry malaria. That really is a typical day around the Media Lab. Except obviously I'm not allowed in whatever room they're doing the mosquito research is in, which is for the best for everyone. But there's actually a lot weirder stuff people do around the building, usually at night when the mice come out to keep the graduate students company. And there's a strong culture of students working on secret side projects adjacent to the main research they're working on. It's a place full of inspiration from colleagues from radically different fields, and so we students need to find many outlets, like side projects, to find outlets for these distractions. So the story I'm going to tell you about is how one of these crazy side projects, born of equal parts passion and mischief-making, became one of the most meaningful projects I've ever worked on. So around 5 years ago, one of my colleagues, Catherine D'Ignazio, and I got to talking about our experiences being some of the few women at the Media Lab. Today, less than 20% of the faculty is women, and back when we were talking about it, it was even worse. Being a woman in technology is an exercise in frustration and perseverance, as you might gather from Dr. Bowman's story, but this story, thankfully, is not about internet harassment. Actually, Catherine had just had her third baby while finishing up her master's at the Media Lab, and she was telling me her frustration with using a noisy and painful breast pump and sitting on the bathroom floors of our very fancy building, pumping milk to feed her kid. And this was kind of a record-scratch moment in the conversation. We were like, wait a minute, here we are at this pretty highly regarded engineering school, and you're sitting around using a piece of technology that is super painful for you, hasn't been redesigned in decades, and that I literally did not know existed until 5 minutes ago. So we started to ask ourselves, if we're here at this institution and our mission is to invent the future, whose future are we inventing exactly? Does this future not include breastfeeding women and babies for some reason? And why are we all so obsessed with Bitcoin and VR and neglecting everyday technologies that matter to so many people? So in side project fashion, we decided we had to do something about it. And so we pulled together a merry band of engineers and designers around the lab, mostly new parents who had some empathy for this situation. And we hosted a small workshop to talk about how we might build a better breast pump ourselves. So at the end of this workshop, we wrote a blog post that sort of summarized what we had been thinking, and we had a line at the end that asked people to send us an email if they had any ideas for improving the pump. And we expected maybe 12 emails or something, and we got 1,200 emails from people around the country. It was amazing. And the emails were long, they were detailed, multiple-page Google Docs with like a 10-point plan for improving the pump, written at 2 in the morning while mom was pumping. So it was at this point that we sort of took a pause and realized that maybe this was a conversation and an effort that we should think about opening up to more people. We heard lots of stories of many things, including social isolation. So your mother, 8697, says, Pumping is so isolating. It sucks to have to leave friends and family or have to go home in the middle of a party to pump. We heard stories about pain. I love breastfeeding my 8-month-old, but hate pumping. I cried the first time I pumped at the hospital, early latch issues, and struggle still to do it every day. If you think this doesn't seem very advanced, you're right. The basic design of the breast pump hasn't changed since the early 1900s. This particular pump was patented in 1914. And so the first Make the Breast Pump Not Suck hackathon was born in 2014. Most of you probably heard of what a hackathon is, but if you haven't, it's not about hacking into computers, but it's a problem-solving focused event where people come together around a design challenge, make prototypes, they eat pizza, and they don't go to sleep for a few days. Honestly, our focus on the breast pump ruffled some feathers in the building. I think people weren't sure if we were joking, if this device was worth innovating for, if it was a worthy target for innovation, or what a breast pump even was. But as I said, we like making a little mischief, and one of our goals was to change our own culture of innovation at the Media Lab, and so we did it anyway. We gathered 150 moms, dads, midwives, designers, engineers, and more into a room, and for 2 days, we worked on this design challenge. It was a little different than most hackathons. We kept the pizza, but we encouraged people to go home and sleep in their own beds at the end of the night, which is, I think, a sound practice. I'd never seen so many women or babies at a hackathon before. It was in many ways a huge success. It was a hugely transformational event for many of the people who attended. Some decided to go back to graduate school as a result of their participation in the event. It pushed the market to develop newer and better pumps, as we ended up partnering with many of the breast pump companies. And they were pretty good sports about being massively called out for having a product that people didn't like, I have to say, so credit to them. And it got a ton of press, because I think the words MIT and breast in a headline is very, very interesting. And that press might have been actually the biggest asset of all in helping push the culture of MIT and the broader technology community to consider this topic and women's health technologies more generally as worthy of innovation. So we were happy at first, but in looking at some of the ideas coming out of the event, which were for like ultra-smart, high-tech pumps, and in some of the price points of new pumps coming to market, up to $1,000 in some cases, we realized that this was not exactly the future we wanted to invent either. Because people were still being left out of the imagining of the future that we created, we all missed the opportunity to raise the bar for everyone. And working towards joyful futures means that you're going to screw up sometimes, and we did. So we realized that we cannot innovate for the 1%. We can't innovate just for people who can afford $1,000 pumps. When we think about who can afford a pump at that price point, it's, in the US, people largely with good jobs, who may have places to pump in the workplace, who probably have paid leave, which is a rarity. I'll talk a bit more about the context of that, as it might be quite unusual for this audience. And who can probably also afford the support of a lactation consultant when things go wrong. And we believe that good design and innovation doesn't leave out 99% of people, and it centers people who face the most barriers. So we thought back to some of those emails we received in 2014, where we heard stories about all the other things that suck beyond just the pump itself. For those of you from countries with paid family leave, you may be wondering why so many women use breast pumps in the first place in the United States. And one answer for that lies in the policy landscape. So here's an email message from 2014 that really stood out to us. Ultimately, no pumping technology can overcome the fact that our society pushes women back to work too early, with loads of supply-dropping stress about how costly childcare is. And until we fix that on the policy front, no pump is going to meaningfully change the landscape of what nursing mothers are up against. Our reflections about the shortcomings of the first hackathon got us right back to the questions that we started with. Whose future are we inventing here, and who is missing from this imagining of the future? Our team of 6 women really began to grapple with the fact that there are so many people who don't have a seat at the table, whose voices are not listened to in the halls of power at institutions of technology and innovation like MIT. And we knew we could do better than we'd done before. We could bring together a community that reflected a greater diversity of experience and expertise that would center the people who are most left out of existing conversations about breastfeeding innovation in order to work towards our joyful future. So it was time for Make the Breast Pump Not Suck version 2.0. We started to think a lot about equity and systems. So we recognized that systems of oppression in the United States have made breastfeeding into a luxury good. Babies from well-off families are more likely to get it, and babies from less well-off families are less likely to get it. White babies are more likely to be breastfed than babies of color. Black women in the United States face greater risk of maternal mortality than white women. For these reasons, breastfeeding and reproductive health more broadly are not just public health issues, they are economic and social justice issues. So what is framed as a personal choice for women to breastfeed or to not, it isn't actually a real choice if you have to go right back to work, if you have no support, if you can't afford the time it takes to do so, or if you aren't given appropriate health information. But we believe in this quote by our friends at the Equity Design Collaborative: racism and inequity are products of design, they can be redesigned. This is actually the title of a terrific article that I recommend, which I highly recommend. And the main point that they make is that racism and inequity can be both intentionally and unintentionally designed into systems and artifacts. So unintentionally, when designers like ourselves fail to reflect on their own biases and make choices about how to address them. So to work towards addressing our own biases for the second version of the hackathon, we spent a year prior to the event building relationships across many lines of difference: racial, socioeconomic, geographic, and more. Led by my teammates, Jennifer Roberts and Rebecca Michelson, we worked with community groups from around the country who were already working in their communities on breastfeeding supportive technologies and services. So centers of innovation like MIT often overlook innovation work communities are already doing to make the world better. And we wanted to use our institutional resources to uplift and support the critical work that people are already doing. So we worked with these teams for 6 months prior to the event to help them develop some of their existing projects into something that they could bring to the hackathon that would benefit from using the resources and people available over the weekend. Each team consisted of talented innovators and passionate advocates for low-income families and their communities in Boston, Massachusetts, Tupelo, Mississippi, Detroit, Michigan, and Albuquerque, New Mexico. And these teams worked on diverse ideas, from building a freestanding birthing center in Boston, the first of its kind, to a self-advocacy breastfeeding toolkit to increase lactation support and education in Detroit, to adapting indigenous peoples' clothing, traditional ceremonial clothing for breastfeeding and pumping in New Mexico, to a toolkit for community health workers in Mississippi. Hackathons were new for members of our community innovation program, and they served as key design partners for us in rethinking the hackathon model and transforming it into something better. So the second Make the Breast Pump Not Suck festival drew around 250 people across all the events. And for about 75% of the people who came, it was their first hackathon. So we really wanted to make it into a beautiful experience. And I would love to show you some clips of folks in our community describing in their own words what they worked on at the event.
I think our community innovation teams are like the highlight.
We have 4 community innovation teams coming from Tupelo, Mississippi, Albuquerque, New Mexico, Detroit, and Boston.
So Harambe Care is a maternal infant health program. The focus of our design is to ensure that families have access to timely lactation care.
We are a nonprofit that works around birth and breastfeeding equity for women of color. What we are designing is a movement, an entire social media platform.
We are working on the LACPAC toolkit, which is an infant feeding toolkit for disasters.
Everybody who wanted to had a 60-second opportunity to kind of tell the audience their wonderful idea and invite other people to work with them.
New mother to a 4-month-old. My name is Camille, and I'm her best friend and not a mom. My name is Rachel Lorenzo. I'm one of the community innovation teams, and we have our prototypes of me. And I pumped religiously for 3 months for my quintuplets, carried them full term. So when that nurse told me she threw away the milk, ain't nobody got time for that.
I'm excited about what will result and also the partnerships that are formed here and also the friendships and the networking, and hopefully that will continue after this event is over.
I really don't know what to expect, actually, because one of the joys and magic of the hackathon is just that lots of people come together with different ideas, and we worked hard to provide whatever materials they might need. So there's going to be a sewing station and a 3D printing station, an electronics workbench, and a whole bunch of materials, but I really don't know what people will do with them, and I'm really excited to see what they come up with. So hopefully that gives you a little taste of what it was like. Many amazing innovations came out of this event, way different than $1,000 breast pumps, because who was in the room was way different than the first time, and the room was full of dedicated people solving problems that they themselves faced or that communities they worked with faced. So one of my favorite examples, briefly shown in the video, this is the infant-ready emergency feeding kit to support breastfeeding in a natural disaster. So the New Orleans Breastfeeding Center just shared this image with us a couple days ago, and the event was about a year ago, for some context. They scaled up their prototype from the hackathon into something they're now currently distributing across the city of New Orleans, which has a city which has faced devastating hurricanes and floods. So this is a really important problem that they themselves deeply knew about and took it to their own hands to solve. So given that Make the Breast Pump Not Suck 2.0 was our chance to make some serious changes, we thought a lot about the hackathon structure itself, its strengths and its shortcomings, and we realized we had an opportunity to hack the hackathon. So the strengths of the hackathon format are numerous, gathering a community of passionate people together in person, pulling together different skills and perspectives, and giving people an opportunity to be playful and creative outside of their day jobs. So these are all amazing things. But hackathons are not known for being the most inclusive events, and nor for having a great deal of real-world outcome outside of the 1 or 2 days that they usually are structured. So we decided to rethink everything from who typically attends, to what happens in the space, to the way people share ideas at the end. So we made lots and lots of changes. The first change was about who was in the room. So in the United States, hackathons typically attract young, white, male technologists. While our first hackathon had many babies and women in attendance, which is pretty rare, it was still largely a very white space. So we changed the way we recruited and advertised the hackathon so we could reach new audiences, both a more racially and socioeconomically diverse audience, and also one that included many skill sets beyond just engineering. We also raised significant funds to support the travel of people who otherwise couldn't afford to come to an event like this, because it's one thing to invite people, and it's quite another to actually make it possible for them to attend. So this was really important. Hackathons are typically pretty competitive spaces. They're kind of very aggressive and competitive. We did not want our space to feel like that. So at our first event, we had like typical first, second, and third place prizes. At the second event, we had a series of 12 sort of experiential and relationship-based prizes that were designed to help people take their projects forward to the next level. So it really upended the competitive atmosphere that you usually see. Instead of focusing on people giving polished pitch presentations at the end, like they're the CEO of a company, which sometimes happens at hackathons, we had a science fair format that enabled two-way conversations and relationship building in favor of presenting a kind of a polished narrative. Hackathons typically focus on technology alone and not systemic and structural issues. So we expanded our definition of innovation and framed the set of issues people hacked much more broadly, which I'll get into a bit more later. And lastly, hackathons are not known for producing innovations that last beyond 2 days. So we focused on making space for new projects, yes, and newcomers, and also finding a way to amplify and support ongoing work out in the world related to breastfeeding innovation. So this we largely did through the Community Innovation Program that I told you guys about. And prior to the second hackathon, we also spent a lot of time just listening. So led by my teammate, Kate Krontiris, we interviewed parents of different racial and socioeconomic backgrounds from across the US about their experiences breastfeeding to produce a book that we published just before the event. And several of the participants in this interview study came to the hackathon, and they worked on teams or acted as roving consultants. So their experience and willingness to share their stories made the design so much better and so much more grounded in reality. And in the book, we drew insights from all of the stories of the participants. So we had a section in each person's story about what could have been better to give our hackers and makers some concrete suggestions based on people's real experiences. As we built relationships to make this new community possible, we also did a lot of thinking about our own identities. So we were a team of 6 women, and the 4 white members of our team started to meet monthly for facilitated conversations around whiteness, privilege, and confronting our own roles in propagating racial inequities. So this is pretty uncomfortable work to do, and it was through our relationships we'd built through trying to create something together that allowed us to kind of go deep and have authentic conversations about the ways in which we mess up when we don't consider power imbalances that may not be apparent to us. So we learned how to hold ourselves and each other accountable. This had a huge impact on us, our ability to communicate across lines of difference, on the project itself, and I highly recommend doing this kind of work to anyone working across lines of racial or other difference. There are no easy answers, no checklist. It's ongoing work, and it's just a huge part of my practice going forward, and I'll take it with me for any project going forward. Even though our team includes a lot of MIT nerds, we still recognize that focusing on technology alone is not going to help us solve the many problems I explained. So I mentioned earlier some of the context of family leave in the United States. It's almost non-existent. About 25% of people who give birth in the US go back to work within 10 days of giving birth. So that is not enough time to heal, let alone to build up a milk supply for your child. So it's pretty dismal. So to complement the hackathon, we pulled together a simultaneous convening led by Dr. Binta Beard called Make Family Leave Not Suck Policy Summit, which brought together policy leaders to hack paid family and medical leave, which is inaccessible to about 85% of people who give birth in the United States. So one of the things that happened shortly after the event is we took our carnival on the road. So we traveled to Washington, D.C. To share some of the ideas from the Policy Summit and the Hackathon with our senators. Many of our hackathon participants joined us at these gatherings. So we met with 16 offices over a couple of days, covering all the different places we were coming from. Change at this level is slow, and paid family and medical leave is not something that's going to happen in our current administration in the United States. However, learning how to do this kind of advocacy work is a critical skill for everyone on our team going forward, and it's something that we're committed to fighting for alongside the technology design work that we're doing. Bringing people together to design for equity requires cultivating a spirit of joy and play, which helps people and institutions build relationships across lines of difference. But I'd like to complicate the matter of joy and play for a moment. It's not enough to convene a diverse group of people expecting them to magically arrive at a radically better future. In fact, doing so is likely to surface tensions. So that means you absolutely need to prioritize the comfort of people who have been made to feel unwelcome in innovation spaces. This is key to both community building and creative problem solving. I think joy and play can act as strategies of resistance in toxic times. They can help restore us so that we can do the difficult and creative work of tackling systemic problems together. That said, I don't think joy is an escape. It is the means of building something new. I return often to this quote from a terrific book called Joyful Militancy by Nick Montgomery and Carla Bergman. For joy to flourish, it needs sharp edges. So what does it mean for joy to have sharp edges? For us, it means that our joy must not gloss over pain, anger, grief in service of so-called harmony. It means taking a stand and having boundaries, refusing to compromise on certain values. So in order to create an environment that was truly warm and welcoming, our hackathon had many sharp edges. We chose to center women of color, which means explicitly not centering white women in our recruitment efforts and in who we selected to attend the event. We asked everyone to uphold a set of community agreements so that we could each hold each other accountable for how we treated each other in the space. And we began the workshop with, the hackathon with a workshop on equity, in order to create a shared vocabulary and understanding of how we might think about and address our own biases. So these were some of the sharp edges that allowed us to make genuine space for joy and play. And play we did. We had a lot of fun. We had a beautiful art exhibition curated by Laura Zittrain that was showcasing the issue not just from a product or a policy angle, but one of human experience. So this kind of third space offered people a chance to connect and converse with one another outside of having to be productive in one of the other spaces. We baked 500 boob cupcakes in a variety of skin tones to hand out to our participants. We had a product expo with 30 companies, large and small, showcasing all their innovations, all surrounding a baby village where people were hanging out with their little ones. We had a zine library curated by Maria Aaron Jones. We brought in plants and couches to transform what was otherwise a sterile tech space because we believe how people feel in a space and in their bodies matters. All of these opportunities for play and reflection allowed people to open up creatively and be generative of new ideas and solutions. This energy and this silliness and joy, combined with our sharp edges, made the weekend a great success. Breast pumps are not the only piece of technology that's been neglected for women and people who breastfeed. The world is quite literally designed for men. In her book, Invisible Women, Data Bias in a World Designed for Men, Caroline Perez writes that the medical system is, from root to tip, systematically discriminating against women, leaving them chronically misunderstood, mistreated, and misdiagnosed. Because the white and male body is seen as the default body and female bodies of color as atypical, products and even drugs are often not tested on populations beyond men. So Perez writes about one such shocking case where a heart medication was released that was meant to prevent heart attacks, but at a certain point in a woman's menstrual cycle, it was actually more likely to trigger a heart attack. So they didn't test this medication with women at different stages of their menstrual cycle because it was deemed too complicated and too expensive. Are we willing to let women die rather than doing a more complicated test? Are women too complicated for medicine? This leads me into what's next for us. We continue to help nurture the breast pump community in various ways with follow-up events. We have one at the end of August in association with Black Breastfeeding Week, a smaller hackathon. We're listening to feedback about our second event so we can reflect on areas where we could have done better. And we're also scheming up new ways to open up conversations about technology, policy, and equity at MIT. So we're planning another hackathon because we just can't help ourselves. This time it's about menstrual equity, and it's called There Will Be Blood. So on average, people who menstruate get their periods for 2,500 days of their lives. That's almost 7 years of bleeding. And menstrual health is linked to broader sexual and reproductive health, as well as to one's ability to participate in economic, civic, and social life. While periods are experienced by half of the world's population, they remain stigmatized and overlooked as a site of innovation and research. So research on menstruation lags behind compared with other life stages and experiences. And because there's little empirical data available, most educational materials are incorrect or non-existent. So consequently, many communities experience low menstrual literacy, which further increases the shame and stigma around periods. So periods are political. Inequitable policies, such as the tampon tax, work to prevent access to essential menstrual products and place an unfair burden on menstruating individuals. So the tampon tax in the United States and in some other places in the world refers to the fact that menstrual supplies are subject to sales tax, and they are in the majority of states in the United States, despite the fact that many other things are exempt, including, in some states, collectible coins, sporting events tickets, and golf club memberships. So this tax places an undue burden on people who menstruate, and for people in poverty, this adds up. The needs of menstruating people are neglected across a wide range of contexts in the United States, including schools, workplaces, homeless shelters, and prisons. And beyond neglect, there are some major injustices that occur. So in prisons, for example, menstrual supplies are sometimes withheld from incarcerated people as part of messed up power dynamics. So prison reform advocate Kimberly Haven at Left here, she couldn't get menstrual supplies while in prison, so she made her own out of toilet paper. After her release in 2015, she suffered from toxic shock syndrome and required an emergency hysterectomy. So these are real stories and real issues. As Jennifer Weiss-Wolf writes in her excellent book, Periods Gone Public, Making a Stand for Menstrual Equity, For those who are marginalized by lack of resources, lack of power, by lack of agency, they are rendered exponentially more at risk by their periods. So at There Will Be Blood in September, we'll convene technologists, policymakers, designers, and activists around this cause. And we're not just going to be hacking technology, as with the breast pump, but social norms, educational materials. We're going to be bringing attention to inequities faced by menstruating people, and more. We're going to hack all the things, and I can't wait. I'm really excited about it. When I'm in the middle of being depressed about the seemingly certain doom of a less than joyful future, I'll go back through some of the photos from this event and think about that Sunday morning when I was convinced that joyful futures are possible. Futures where communities of people, not a lone genius in a lab, gather on a Sunday morning because they care about building a better world. Futures where you make 500 boob cakes just to make people smile. Futures where children learn, build, and play alongside adults. And futures where you make space to have difficult conversations about race and designing for equity because it matters. I want to leave you with some questions to ask yourselves, ones that I continue to ask myself in my own work, whatever it might be. Who gets to imagine and invent the future? Who is missing from this imagining of the future? And whose voices need to be heard and centered to truly build our joyful futures? Thank you. If you'd like to get in touch with me, here are all the ways. So thank you. I think we have some time for some questions. If somebody has a loud voice, it could start, I guess. Oh.
Sorry, the microphone was working. Are there any questions? We have a microphone guy over there, and here are a few hands over there.
That was a really wonderful talk. Thank you for that. I'm really interested to hear maybe a little bit more about some of the structure or like some of the inequity maybe you're hoping to start unpacking in the future hackathon.
Some of the what? I missed the...
maybe the structural inequity you are hoping to unpack. I'm very interested in the There Will Be Blood hackathon.
Yes, yeah. So we're kind of early in our process, but we are partnering with an advocacy group that's founded by a couple of lawyers called Period Equity, and they're about to launch, our timing kind of dovetails nicely with theirs. Next year, they're going to launch a campaign to sue 10 states in the United States to repeal the tampon tax. Excuse me. So our hackers at the event will be creating kind of advocacy materials and things to go along with that campaign. What's really interesting about their campaign is what they're hoping to do is work towards issues beyond just the tampon tax, but putting in forth legal language that actually cements menstrual equity as a concept will help them build forward kind of more things related to like access in schools and homeless shelters, the issues in prisons I talked about. So kind of putting forward this baseline legal language will help build on lots more things. So thanks.
The next question over here, the guy.
Yeah, also thank you very much for this inspiring talk.
Could you please stand up?
Yeah, I can stand up.
Great.
Before on stage there was someone talking about solutionism and about like the conflict between the underlying system and like those people who try to fix problems with technology or fix it with like single solutions. And I'm wondering if you have thought about this. So what's your answer between this dualism of doing single solutions or like tackling the whole system thing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think about it a lot. I think in our first hackathon, we always had this idea that like we knew that paid family leave was a problem and that the breast pump, improving the breast pump might just be like a Band-Aid, but we still kind of started there and we offered to people the chance. I think we mentioned at the beginning of the first hackathon, like, oh, if you'd like to hack policy, like that's totally something you can do, go for it. But we didn't offer people any scaffolding to think about how to hack systems and how to think more systemically. So that's, I think, that's one reason why we added the policy summit and why we try and bring in conversations about all of the structural issues, even if people sort of make things that don't directly address that. Having a community of people leave the room with a higher understanding of all these systemic and structural problems is an asset. So we think that like the community we're building is an output just as much as the things in the room.
Perhaps one more question? Are there any hands? No. No, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Alexis. Thank you.
Yeah.